Word must have gone out. We're going live tonight because everybody's gone. There is a handout back here on that little chair, that little folding chair, in case you want one. And we are going to be in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 will just be us'ns, I reckon. The Apostle Paul faced opposition throughout his ministry. Some opposition came in the form of false teachers, such as Elymas. You'll find that account in Acts chapter 13, verses 8 through 12, where Elymas was following Paul and Barnabas around and contradicting everything that they said, trying to dispute the words that Paul had. And Paul eventually got to the point that the Holy Spirit moved him to tell Elymas, well, he'd be without his sight for a while. He doesn't really elaborate as to how long that while is, but that experience affected those who were listening to Paul, and Elymas kind of was put out of the way. Other opposition came in the form of religious leaders. The Jews in Antioch of Pisidia opposed the things that Paul said in Acts 13, verse 45. And similarly in Thessalonica. You know, we've talked about Thessalonica several times, and that's the ones we're writing to. But the Jews there who weren't persuaded, they became envious of Paul. And so they stirred up a mob and created all kinds of trouble for Paul. And it seems, too, that if Paul and his companions escaped some kind of physical abuse, then they were belittled. In Thessalonica, it says these guys that have turned the world upside down are here in this town, and they're causing problems here as well. After Paul left the location, his enemies would come in. They would begin the negative attacks. Sometimes that was questioning his authority. Sometimes that was mocking his speaking ability or challenging the message that he proclaimed. Any way that they could, they sought to undermine his influence. So defending himself against such attacks, Paul told the Corinthian brethren in 2 Corinthians 11:5, do not think that I am the least inferior to those super apostles or most eminent apostles, depending on your translation. I may not be a trained speaker, but I do have knowledge. We have made this perfectly clear to you in every way. But his greatest defense was not really his writing, but rather his conduct. This is why he was resolved to guard himself and his behavior and that of his team very carefully. And he explains this in 1 Corinthians 9. He says, I buffet my body, or I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I may not be disqualified for the prize. And so in our lesson text tonight, 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 through 12, Paul is defending his conduct to the Thessalonians. He will tell them over and over again, you know. And you might just want to kind of zip down through there and mark, underline, highlight the times that he says, you know. The first one that I found was back in chapter 1, verse 5. Just as you know, brethren. But in chapter 2, verse 1, chapter 2, verse 2, chapter 2, verse 9, chapter 2:10, he says you are witnesses, which is the same thing. 2:11, just as you know. And then in chapter 13, chapter 3, verse 3, you yourselves know. And verse 4, as you know. And chapter 4, verse 2, for you know. And chapter 5, verse 2, you yourselves know full well. Over and over again, he is reminding the Thessalonian brethren of what they know. So this is not new. They knew that his time with them had been fruitful, verse 1. They also knew his motives and methods were pure and good. They knew that Paul was not selfish. They knew he was not using flattering words. They knew he was not trying to take advantage of them, verse 5. That he did not seek his own glory or that of men, verse 6. And that he worked gently and in a concerned manner, and that they were all witnesses of this. So, as I said, what he's doing here is reminding them of what they already know about him. He's not telling them something new. So let's take a look at chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain. But after we had already suffered and been mistreated in Philippi, as you know, we had the boldness in our God to speak to you the gospel of God amid much opposition. For our exhortation does not come from error or impurity or by way of deceit. But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who examines our hearts. For we never came with flattering speech, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, even as apostles of Christ we might have asserted our authority. But we proved to be gentle among you, as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. Having so fond an affection for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become very dear to us. For you recall, brethren, our labor and hardship, how working night and day, as not to be a burden to any of you, we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and so is God, how devoutly and uprightly and blamelessly we behave toward you believers. Just as you know how we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would his own children, so that you would walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. So he starts out by saying, you know, brethren, that when I was there in Thessalonica, my time was well spent. Now, if you remember a couple weeks ago when we talked about him going to Thessalonica, he was only teaching and preaching in the synagogue for 3 Sabbaths. After that, he was there for some time. We don't know how long, but we do know that he says here, and he said in chapter 1, that he worked night and day so as he would not be a burden to any of them. So you got to think it was longer than that. And we know from the Philippian letter that the Philippians sent to him time and again for his need, even while he was in Thessalonica. And we talked about that, just to travel back and forth is going to take you more than a couple of weeks to get there and to get back. So my guess would be that he was there several months, 6 months, maybe even a year. Don't know. Overall, time was considered short, but they knew that his visit there was a success. He was successful in planning a congregation. He also says that they had previously suffered and been insulted at Philippi, as they knew. One of the things that the detractors of Paul would say was, this guy's been in prison. This guy has been hauled in front of the court. He's a criminal. Well, that might strike somebody as a bad thing, except for the fact that Paul's already told them that he was in prison. Paul's already told them why he was in prison, and the fact that it was wrong that he was in prison, and the fact that his punishment was wrong. As a Roman citizen, he should never have been placed in prison without a trial. He should never have been beaten without a trial. So all of that was wrong, and he says, you Thessalonians, y'all know that. So when they come to you and they're telling you about my being in prison, it's not going to be a surprise to you. You know good and well, I'm not a criminal. I haven't been breaking any laws, but just upsetting people. When he's talking there at Philippi, the whole thing, if you remember in Acts chapter 16, Paul goes to Philippi, and as he's going through the city and he's teaching, there's a slave girl there that is possessed by an evil spirit. And that evil spirit allows her to predict the future for some people. And so she has some handlers. And these handlers are making money off of her ability to do this. Well, when Paul and Barnabas come, or Paul and Silas rather come, and they're going around the city and they're teaching, this little slave girl, the demon speaking through her is saying that these men are followers of God, and they are teaching the way of salvation. Well, that's true. But about the last thing you want, if you are a teacher of God and you are teaching the way of salvation, is a demon professing that that's what you're doing. Because you're going to trust the demon anyway. All right? That's not the kind of backing that you want. And so after it had gone on for several days, Paul turns and commands the demon to leave her. And it does. And of course, that's when the trouble starts, because her handlers realize that along with that demon, there went their money. Because they can no longer misuse her for gain. So they're the ones then that drag Paul and Silas in front of the court. They're the ones that accuse them of teaching things that, as Romans, it's forbidden for them to do. And then the magistrates are all bent out of shape. Oh, well, if we're breaking Rome's law, this is bad. And so they don't listen to the fact that Paul and Silas are both Roman citizens. Instead, they have them stripped, they have them beaten, have them thrown inside an inner prison and locked up. And you know how that goes. Paul and Silas singing and praying, the prisoners listening in, the jailer going to sleep, and all of a sudden there's an earthquake and the chains fall off. The jailer is fixing to kill himself, and they shout into another room, "Don't do yourself no harm, we're all still here." He calls for lights. Now don't you think if you're in the darkness and you're in another room and somebody calls out to you, "Do yourself no harm," that would just stop you dead? Stop you cold, whatever you're doing? And he comes in then and he takes them to his house. He washes their stripes. He asks them what he must do to be saved. They preach to him the gospel, him and his house. They're all baptized. Next day, the magistrates send down there to the prison to find them. They're not there. I said, well, you guys, actually, they were there. And the magistrate said, "You guys got to leave town." I go, "No, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. We're Roman citizens. They need to come down here and beg us to leave." And that's what happens. The magistrates actually have to go down there and console them and beg them basically to leave their city. And they don't go directly. Instead, they go back to Lydia's house and they tell the church exactly what's happened and the fact that they are okay, and let's pray for boldness so that we can continue the message. So that's what had preceded Paul going to Thessalonica. And when he gets to Thessalonica, he tells them the whole thing because it's a great story. I mean, he had established a church there, Lydia being one of the chief people that was in that area, a seller of purple from Thyatira, actually in Asia, but she's over in Philippi now. Set that congregation up, also converted the jailer and his entire family. So great things happening in Philippi. And Paul was not above sharing it all. As a matter of fact, he was sharing it all because, as he said, you know this story, you know how it happened. But he says we are telling this, we dared to tell the gospel, or we were bold to tell the gospel. It's an athletic term that he uses here at the end where he says of strong opposition. It means a contest or a struggle. And basically that's what it is, because he is warring against the enemy factions of Satan to make sure that this preaching is done. And Satan is doing everything he can to stir up anybody and everybody in that town, initially the Jews, but also the Romans as well, to do Paul in. He likes using athletic terms. In 1 Corinthians 9, 24 through 27, he talks about running a race and training his body in order that if he runs the race, he can run it to win. In Philippians 3, 13 and 14, he says, "Forgetting what lies behind, I strain forward for the prize that is ahead." In 2 Timothy 4, 7, he says, "I fought the fight, finished the course, kept the faith. There's a crown of righteousness that waits for me." All of this, athletic terms that he's using, and it's similar to what he's using here in verse 2. In Philippians chapter 1, 29 through 30, he says, "For it has been granted me on behalf of Christ not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for him, since you are going through the same struggle," and that's that same word right there, the same struggle that you saw I had and that you hear that I still have. So that same strong opposition or that struggle, same term. So in spite of the threats, in spite of the enemies that are out there, he's going on and teaching and preaching the gospel. He then says, "For the appeal that we make is not one that springs from error, impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you." This word that is appeal or it's exhortation It's an urgent appeal to turn from idols to the living God. Okay? So it's not just we're making a question of you, we're trying to persuade you. He said, no, this is an urgent appeal, or an exhortation. New American Standard, New King James says exhortation. The NIV and the ESV both say appeal. But he qualifies it here too. He says it's not of error. In other words, this didn't come from some kind of lie. This is the truth that we are speaking. He also says it's not coming from impurity. New American Standard says impurity. New King James says uncleanness. The NIV says impure motives. New Century says wrong reasons. So his motives were pure. So he's talking from the truth. He's talking with pure motives. And then he says it's not of deceit. The New American Standard, New King James both say deceit. The NIV and the New Century both say trick. So he's not using some kind of guile or trickery on these people. Instead, he is talking truth from pure motives, and it's an honest appeal to them to turn from idols to serving God. He also says that we are not speaking as men, but rather we are speaking as those approved of God. That God has entrusted us with the gospel. And you can slip down to verse 6 and you see essentially the same thing. We're not seeking the glory from men, either from you, Thessalonians, nor from any others. Even though as apostles we might have authority and we might be able to assert that authority, we're not doing so. We're just appealing to you as men approved of God, trusted with the gospel. And then he'll do the same thing in verse 5. He says, you know that we never use flattery or flattery words, nor did we put on a mask to cover up our greed. God is our witness. So he appeals both to their knowledge of who he is and what he did, and God's knowledge of who he is and what he did. They didn't use flattering words. They didn't use some kind of mask to cover themselves up. Flattery is something that is used to manipulate somebody as opposed to communicate with somebody. Paul says we're trying to communicate with you. We're trying to communicate this message. We're not trying to trick you. We're not trying to manipulate you to do what we want you to do. This is on the up and up. And he says too in verse 6, as I said, it kind of ties right directly with verse 4, that we're not looking for praise from men, not you Thessalonians nor anyone else. So you put these three together, or these two verses 5 and 6 together, there are three claims that are kind of substantiated here. The first is, unlike false teachers who follow their own evil desires and boast about themselves and flatter others for their own advantage, like Jude 16 says, Paul spoke in plain, straightforward words. Secondly, Paul did not use preaching as a pretext for greed. And this point is made also in verse 9. So Paul states that God and the Thessalonian Christians are witnesses of the fact that he's not in it for greed. He's not in it for money. He's in it for God's purposes. And the third thing is Paul did not seek glory, personal recognition, or fame. His focus was on Christ and his gospel and not on Paul himself. Paul is concerned with the integrity of the message. He wants them to know that this is the gospel. It is only the gospel and nothing but the gospel. And he deliberately avoids any behavior, any words or actions that would lead people to doubt or suspect that he was anything but what he appears to be. So the integrity of the message is there. The sincerity of the preaching is there. You know, some had accused Paul of being one person when he was around and another person when he was writing. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 8 through 11, Paul says, therefore, even if I boast somewhat freely about the authority the Lord has given us for building you up rather than pulling you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you with my letters. For some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing. Such people should realize that what we are in our letters when we are absent, we will be in our actions when we are present. So what you see is what you get, basically. And he's not one thing when he's away from you, hiding off in Corinth, writing a letter back. And this letter is very powerful. But when he shows up, well, he's weak and he doesn't really assert himself, Paul says. And that's not the case. We're going to be the same people when we show up as we are when we're writing this letter. In verse 7, he talks about his gentleness. He says, as apostles of Christ, we could have been a burden to you, but we were gentle among you like a mother caring for her little children. As an apostle, as a preacher of the gospel, he has a right to get money for what he's doing. And he will say that, and we'll even touch on those verses here in just a little bit. But he says, I was being gentle to you. I was not going to be a burden to you. Instead, I was with you like a mother caring for her little children. And every version that you look at, it's either a nursing mother tenderly caring for her own children, New American Standard, nursing mother cherishing her own children, New King James, a nursing mother caring or taking care of her own children, ESV, a nurse cherishes her own children, King James, and a mother caring for her little children, New Century. So in every case, we're talking about a mother taking care of her own children. And there's probably nothing more tender than mom taking care of her baby, especially a nursing mom taking care of her nursing baby. You know, one of the things that hit me when I was going through this, and this shows you how bizarre my brain is sometimes, but this is another one of those cases that proves that this theory of evolution is stupid. Right? I mean, it is, but this is one of those things that proves it. Because with this theory, it's survival of the fittest. So the things that are less fit die off. And yet, if you look across nature, the things that are lower on the totem pole, their young are born fully able to take care of themselves. Not ours. And we are the most fully developed at the top of the chain. So why aren't our babies fully able to take care of themselves from day one? Because when you look at the other things at the bottom of the chain, when they're born, mom and dad usually aren't around. Matter of fact, insects, they died off. Right? And yet, they don't need to learn. They don't need somebody to take care of them. They don't need somebody to feed them. But our babies are absolutely helpless. And mom has to ingest food, process that food, and actually convert it into milk, a food that this baby can use to grow. You wouldn't think, if that theory held any water, that would be the case. That would be something that the things low on the totem pole would have happened, and as you progressed, as you got better, it'd go away. Not the case. Oh well. Anyway, like I said, that's one of my brain goes sideways sometimes. 1 Peter 2, verses 1 through 3 says, therefore rid yourself of all malice, deceit, hypocrisy, evil, slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. And a verse that we touched on in our Hebrews study, in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 11 through 14, the Hebrew writer there says, we have much to say about this, talking about Christ, but it's hard to explain because you are slow to learn. In fact, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need that someone teach you the elementary truths of God's Word all over again. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness, but solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. Just like a nursing mom is taking in food, processing that food, preparing it in her body for that baby to nurture up, grow that baby into a toddler, Paul is saying he and Silas are doing the same thing. We're taking in the deep truths of God's Word, and we are processing it, and we are giving you what you can handle. We're giving you what you can use and what you can devour and what your body will use, your spiritual body will use so that you can grow. And then after a period of time, like the Hebrew writer says, you will be able to discern good from evil. Not initially maybe, but certainly after a while. You need milk first. After that, you're going to get solid food. So you get the simple teachings first, then you're going to get the deep stuff. And then certainly when the congregation grows up, the congregation will be strong. He says you will know in Ephesians 4:14 through 16, then you will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of men and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body is joined and held together by every supporting ligament. It grows and it builds itself up in love as each does its own work. So, Paul's saying just like the physical body, so is the spiritual body. It's milk first, then it's going to be meat. So we're giving you the easy stuff first. He says we're treating you like a mother would take care of her infant. He also says that not only are we willing to teach you, but we're also willing to share with you our own lives. Verse 8, he says that we are so touched by you, we are so much in love with you, we have grown to appreciate you so much that we want to share our lives with you. So not only Paul and Silas not want anything from the Thessalonians, they rather wanted to give themselves to the Thessalonians as they shared the gospel with them. And it's this deep personal connection, this deep personal relationship that goes between Paul, Silas, and these Thessalonians that separates Paul and Silas from the charlatans, the guys that are out here just trying to get money, just trying to rip the people off, you know. And they were folks running around all over Rome, coming into town, preaching the gospel, you know, collecting up money and then running off. Paul had been accused of being that. He says, I'm not that. And it's his relationship that definitely says that he is different. He also says, surely you remember, brother, our toil and our hardship, how we work night and day in order not to be a burden to any one of you while we preach the gospel to you. You know, fathers work. Blake talked about that in his lesson this morning. A father works to support his family. Even though the Christians at Philippi sent financial relief to Paul, Paul worked. And no one could accuse him of using his ministry for profit. This toil and hardship that he says in here, that means it was hard work. Making tents is not easy. And Paul was a tent maker. And that's what he did when he was not preaching, making tents. But as I said earlier, as a teacher, as a preacher, as an apostle, he had the right to earn money from the gospel. Philippians 4:14 through 16, what we've referenced a couple times, he says, yet it was good of you, Philippians, to share in my troubles. Moreover, as you know, Philippians, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you only. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent to me aid again and again when I was in need. And that's kind of what I said before. Likely he was in Thessalonica for some time, because not only was he working night and day, but also the Philippian brethren were sending money to him. Galatians 6:6, anyone who receives instruction from the word must share all good things with his instructor. Authorization for paying the person that's preaching the word to you. 1 Timothy 5:17 and 18, the elders who direct the affairs of the church well are worthy of double honor, especially those who work in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, do not muzzle the ox that is treading out the grain, quoting Deuteronomy 25:4, and the worker deserves his wages, quoting Luke 25:4. So, you can pay a preacher, and guess what? If an elder is also a preacher, you need to pay him twice. What it says. Paul says he didn't want to burden them. In 1 Corinthians 9, 7 through 14, Paul says there, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk? Do I say this merely from a human point of view? Does not the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses. And here he's going to quote the very same thing. It is not written in the law of Moses, for it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while he is treading out the grain. Deuteronomy 25:4. Is it about the ox that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, does he not? Yes, it was written for us because when the plowman plows, when the thresher threshes, they ought to do so in hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown a spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? He'd already made a point about Peter taking along his wife, other apostles taking along an entourage with them. Don't we have that right too? Paul and Silas, he says. Well, of course they do. But we do not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Don't you know that those who work in the temple get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? Referring back to the law of Moses and how it was to take care of the Levites. In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. So Paul had the right. He could demand that they pay him while he's there. But he said, I didn't do that while I was in Thessalonica. Matter of fact, he didn't do that in Corinth as well. But he will later, I think in the second letter to the Corinthians, actually apologize for not asserting that right that he had with them and actually inducing them to pay. That I guess he felt like he had done them a disservice by not requiring them to take care of him while he was there. So anyway, Father's work. That's the first point. And then in verse 10, you are witnesses and so is God. So he's calling on, he says, you guys know this. You guys know this already. God knows this as well. How holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believe. So fathers not only work, they also provide an example. And he says this example that we have is that we were devout or holy, or devout and holy are the two translations that I have. New American Standard, New King James say devoutly. NIV says holy. Paul's life was holy. In the Greek, this means to carefully fulfill the duties that God has given to a person. So it is not fake religion. It is the word that's actually applied to God in Revelation 15:4 and Revelation 16:5. So, Father, holy example. Is also uprightly is the New American Standard. Justly is the New King James. Righteous is the NIV. Paul's life was also righteous. That refers to his integrity, his uprightness of character, and his behavior. And then the third, basic is blameless. It's blamelessly in New American Standard, New King James. It is blameless in the NIV. So Paul's life was unblameable. That literally means that nobody was able to find a fault in it. Not that he never did any wrong, but that those were taken care of. His enemies might accuse him of something, but nobody could level a charge against him and prove it. So you can call him anything that you want, but you cannot prove it. So fathers work. Fathers provide an example. And then in verse 11 he says, for you know how we dealt with each one of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you. Fathers also encourage. They build up. They support their kids. The first word there is either exhorting, exhorted, or encouraging. Paul encouraged new believers. That meant that he came alongside to support them. So he was helping them along in their walk. The second is either encouraging, comforted, or comforting, depending on your translation. Paul comforted new Christians. And this has more to do with action. It's like the first one has to do with feeling or your ego or how you regard yourself. The second one has to do with what you're doing. The action. It's like, okay, that was a good swing. Let's get up and swing better this time. Okay, you preached the gospel well. You know, he did that in chapter 1. He says, you were preaching well, do it more. He says, you loved more. Are you loved? Now you need to love more. You need to excel in loving. So the first one, it's about how you feel about yourself. The second one is how you're doing at getting things done. And then the third one, he says, is imploring, charged, or urging. Paul is pushing them forward. You need to get busy about doing the work that you've been called to do. So, what is this that he's calling them to do? The goal, the aim, is in verse 12. For we want you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and into his glory. That's the goal. That you can walk closer with God, that you can do what God wants you to do. And he said, we're going to start out slow. We'll give you the easy stuff first. You know, it's milk first, and then we're going to get to meat. I'm urging, I'm consoling, I'm encouraging, I'm leading, I'm supporting. As a mother, as a father, I'm doing everything that I need to do so that I can help you walk worthy of God. And just like we said earlier about the things that Paul wrote, not only were the things that he wrote important, and not only were the things that he wrote tantamount to what they needed to be doing, but one of the biggest proofs that Paul had was his example, his life. Same thing here. When you want to know how to live worthy the manner of God, look at Paul's life. They had his example there for however long, I don't know. But if you remember too, once he got to Athens, he turns around and sends Timothy and Silas back. And Timothy stays the longest. It's not until Timothy returns to Corinth, and they tag up in Corinth. It's not till Timothy gets back and reports to Paul that he actually says, okay, I'm writing this letter. And so that's the point then that he writes this letter to the Thessalonians. So, what does all this mean? Well, it means that the conduct of those who proclaim the gospel really matters. And that's why Paul declared to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 9:27, I beat my body, or I buffet my body, to make it a slave, so that after I have preached to others, I will not be disqualified. Neither his methods of preaching nor his motives for doing so were questionable. His conduct left his enemies void of anything to find fault. And as we seek to reach out to other individuals with the gospel, the same thing needs to be true about us. We need to live in a similar manner so that our life backs up our talk. That we are not only trying to teach people, we're willing to come alongside and help people. We're willing to come alongside and lift, encourage, cajole, however we need to help them along. And secondly, it's not possible to read Paul's defense of his ministry without noticing that he is concerned for the Thessalonians. Although they were aware of his conduct, he found it necessary to remind them of the care that he provided for them. Like a nursing mother, he provided spiritual nourishment that the brethren needed. And like a concerned father, he provided moral direction. So Paul was not a self-promoter. Instead, Paul was a Christ promoter. He was concerned for the Thessalonian Christians, and he did not allow his opponents to cast doubt on his authenticity, nor the importance of the gospel that he preached. Everything he did was above board. And that's why over and over again in this letter, he tells these Thessalonians, you know, and you are witness, and God is witness. Thank you very much for your attention tonight, and we will pick up again next week with verse 13.